You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Hello and welcome to TFM's local watering hole, and I am just so excited to be here as we are coming at you from one of the opulent towers at Coruscant. What could go wrong with all this opulence? And with me this week to help me talk about something very special that has just released on Disney Plus in the last few weeks. A very, very special series called Tales of the Jedi. And unfortunately, Christy has been detained by an Inquisitor, and therefore I had to call in very quickly the one and the only Jedi Master John Mills.
Oh, trust me, everybody's going to miss Christy by the end of this episode with me coming in here trying to fill those shoes. So sorry, Christy, I'll try not to damage things too badly while you're away.
Well, I did just say that this is a very opulent tower here in Coruscant, so please, let's not damage anything, John.
Oh, please. I'm putting it on your credit card. It's no problem. Oh, oops, there we go. More priceless sculptures gone.
It's good that I have that unlimited funds from the banking clan. I'm sure it's fine.
Those slinky munes.
Well, we are very excited to be getting to this, but before we do that, just want to say thank you to everybody who's listening, as we're over 400 episodes now here with the show. Appreciate everybody continuing to subscribe and to follow us all over social media, say on Twitter at the 602 Club or on Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. We would love it if you would review the show on a place like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, help more people find the show. If you like it too, please share us. One of the best ways for podcasts to grow is through word of mouth. And of course, that even happens over social media. You can find us on Facebook with the entire network at facebook.com/TrekFM. And we've got the entire website, trek.fm, where you can see all of the shows that we're doing. If you would like to talk to listeners from all over the network in our special listeners-only discussion group, you can find that housed on Facebook. It's called the Babel Conference. And then last but not least, we would really appreciate it if you would go over to patreon.com/TrekFM and become part of our team. It is a lot of money to put this together, a lot of credits, and we can't do this without you. So please go over to patreon.com/TrekFM and be part of our team. We're actually below the level we need to be at every month to make sure all of these shows keep coming to you. So again, go to patreon.com/TrekFM and see how you can be part of the team. So, John, one of the things that's really interesting about Tales of the Jedi is that they are 6 different shorts, and they are 15 minutes or so in length. I think the longest maybe is 17 minutes. And it specifically is focused on 2 journeys and 2 different Jedi, Dooku and Ahsoka. And so, one of the questions that I thought would be really interesting to discuss before we even kind of dive into anything else here was, these are all written by Dave Filoni. And so why do you think that Dave wanted to focus on these 2 Jedi's journeys specifically?
Well, I mean, I can only conjecture, but putting myself in the mindset that I saw after watching all 6 is the idea that these 2 journeys specifically bracket the hero's journey of Anakin and the galaxy at large. Dooku precedes Anakin and points in the direction he's going to go, and Ahsoka gives an indication of the fact that the Force has a continual pathway toward light that is running at the same time. I think that the juxtaposition of the 2 stories speaks very much to the fact that there's always this light and dark side balance. And while our personal decisions will decide things one way or the other, there's always something else at play that isn't directly in our control. I mean, that's how I read it. How did it come to you?
Well, it was one of those things where it felt like that this was an interesting juxtaposition between two different Jedi who left the Order, and giving us the opportunity to kind of explore the reasons, and in some ways, kind of again, really just juxtapose these two characters and who they are from start to finish, and what it is that makes them want to leave the Order, how they end up doing that, and of course what the end game is for both of them. With Dooku, we definitely know his end game because we see him die in Episode 3, and with Ahsoka, her choices lead her to still be alive, and we have a show coming out live action wise with her next year most likely, and so it just makes me really interested because we don't really see Jedi leave the Order very often, and of course we only know of 20 that had before, and we honestly don't know many of their names, but we do know, of course, that Dooku is one, and then of course Ahsoka becomes another, and so I really love that because the reasons that they choose to leave are very similar in some ways. But also wildly divergent on how they actually do leave and what route they end up going, and kind of whether or not that frustration with the corruption that they see leads them down a dark path, or whether they're able to find a way to still navigate towards the light, just, not as a Jedi.
I think that there's completely valid. I completely plug into what you're saying there. Absolutely, I think that's a great take on that. I think that what is interesting is that Dooku is a character that for many years I have felt needed more exploration beyond even just the Clone Wars.
I agree, and
so I was incredibly heartened to see two things in his journey, and they're very specific. And to speak to your juxtaposition point, I'll go forward to Ahsoka after that. But with Dooku, we see he's straying through he's struggling with it through his adult life, and it is Qui-Gon, the loss of Qui-Gon, that completely unmoors him. He's already started doing bad things,
right,
when before Qui-Gon has died. But he's doing justifiably bad things. He's erasing Camino. He believes the war is coming. You see very much implied in everything that he's not necessarily doing what he sees as evil. Ends justify the means evil. Necessary evil, as Bane might call it. And it's Qui-Gon's death that completely unmoors it. And that's the point of no return for him. Whereas for Ahsoka, it's the presence of Anakin, who's going to be the most storied fallen Jedi, that we've seen up to this point. It's his presence that enables her. He serves, in essence, a Qui-Gon role for her, in what he is able to pass on and what she's able to hold on to. So I think that the juxtaposition is interesting because they both leave for similar reasons, but Ahsoka is motivated by definitely a much more altruistic mindset, whereas Dooku is a much more desperation mindset, I would say. He sees, this even plays into what he says in Attack of the Clones, that, if Qui-Gon had known the depth of the corruption, he'd have joined me. Like, he's still entertaining that thought that Qui-Gon would have made that specific difference for him. And I mean, I'm just thrilled, in all honesty, to have seen this piece of Dooku's journey, because I think it's a critical piece of understanding everything that went wrong and how an idealist can fall apart. And additionally, just what a master manipulator Sidious was.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that it just, in the idea of juxtaposition, I think that's the thing, is that it does, I think, show how idealism can actually lead you to do these type of things. And whereas that's not who Ahsoka is at all. In fact, I would say Ahsoka is more of a realist, you know? And so, and I love that you pulled that out, because I think that really does show us the difference between these two characters. And part of that, I think, is that, you know, one of the things we've talked about many times is, you know, you see that Ahsoka has, you know, not only Anakin, but she has Obi-Wan, and those two combined together, I think, create this Jedi that is, you know, driven and passionate, and yet very down to earth and realistic about what she sees. You know, I think more than Anakin, she definitely has a little bit more of that Obi-Wan ability to kind of see the corruption, you know, see where things aren't quite right. And of course, even, you know, before Obi-Wan does with the Order, right? And so, and I don't think she ever really truly has, you know, Anakin's like love of politicians either. You know, they have to win her over. You know, we see that as well in the storylines we get in the Clone Wars, where, you know, she's more wary of politicians than somebody like Anakin, who has a politician as a best friend and father figure. And so, you know, and again, I think through all of this, what we're creating with these two characters is these different templates of, you know, people who could be predisposed to choose a different path, like a darker path, because of the experiences they have, because of the rejection they see, because of the corruption that they see, because even of the way that they're treated by the Order itself, right? And yet, you know, you get little bits and pieces here, especially, you know, with Dooku, about just there's something in him that, and I think you rightly pointed out, it's that idealism that allows him to be foiled and fooled by the Dark Lord of the Sith. Whereas, you know, Ahsoka, that's not something that's ever would have, I think, really tempted her in that way.
Well, I think there's also a very interesting thing that came to mind when I watched it, which is the Mortis arc. You can see very clearly Anakin should have stepped into the role of the father, gets corrupt, you know, but he's corruptible and, you know, goes the path of the son, those sorts of things. And Ahsoka, of course, becomes Ahsoka the White. She becomes the sister. There's almost, looking at these two arcs in this Tales of the Jedi series, gives me the impression that even though he's the older, obviously, that Dooku is the son, Anakin is the father, and Ahsoka is the sister. Mm-hmm. So we see our sort of triumvirate here. Or possibly we should really say Sidious is the son, because he's the corruptor. And so there's a very interesting, but, you know, I'll stick with Dooku just because it's his story that we're seeing here. But it is interesting how things keep moving in those threes with these stories. And so we know that even though he's not the central figure in these stories, Anakin is very much at the core of it, around which these stories revolve, because of the machinations that Sidious has in place leading up to him, and Dooku is a conduit to that. And then Ahsoka being the Force's way of counterbalancing Anakin's disruption of goodness in the galaxy.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you, and I just think it's a really interesting choice, obviously, because I don't, you know, if you were to ask anybody before these came out and before we knew these were going to be available or were even going to be a thing, right? I don't know if people would have immediately thought, you know what I'd really like to see is a 3-part arc for Ahsoka paired with a 3-part arc for Dooku. You know, like that's probably just not anybody's mind, but obviously Dave Filoni knows best. He is the master, and therefore we shall bow the knee.
Well, I'm also going to throw a very, in my opinion, huge compliment to the crew on this. And I know that we'll talk about the artistry that went into this, and just seeing where the animation has gone. We're doing a commentary on the Bad Batch over on Aggressive Negotiations. We're rewatching season 1 leading into season 2. And it's just stunning to see where the animation has gone from the very earliest days of the Clone Wars to now. how mature it is. We've heaped all of this praise on it. But this series in particular, I will flat out say it. This one feels, of all of the Star Wars series that they've released, and we all know I love The Mandalorian. Every person on the planet loves The Mandalorian who has a brain in their head and a heart in their chest. But of all of the stuff that's been released since the Clone Wars, this is the most evocative of the type of boundaries that Lucas liked to push. These are not hour-long episodes. These are not even half-hour episodes. These evoke for me that first crazy experiment done with Tartakovsky with the original Clone Wars animated series, where Lucas's original proposition was, I want to tell stories in 1 minute. And Tartakovsky said, that's insane. Give me 3 minutes. And Lucas said, fine. These 15-minute vignettes, this is snackable, but impactful and incredibly deep and incredibly effective visual storytelling. I struggle to think of modern Star Wars that has been so perfectly constructed around the idea that I could turn off the sound and I can understand everything that's happening. I can even pick up the dialogue. I could write the dialogue just by watching it and say, okay, I think I know pretty much what people would be saying in this scene. And I think that's very much at the essence of why this is so magnificent and why so many people are warmly embracing it, is it's evocative of that boundary-pushing, compact, efficient storytelling that we all fell in love with to begin with.
And it's so interesting you say that because, one of the criticisms that I've heard even from, lifetime fans is that these are not long enough. that they feel like that there's just, they want more, that they feel like that I'm right there with you because one of the things that I do think that this is a series specifically, I would say, for fans. This is a reward for a fan who has seen every single thing, right? This is for the fan who has seen all of the Clone Wars, has seen all of Rebels, has seen, all of the prequels. You've been immersed in that, right? And this is your reward for that. And to me, these are long enough because what they are doing is they are building on all of the building blocks that we already had, and they are filling in those little tiny story gaps that just kind of help us fully flesh out, who a character is and what's going on in their mind at these specific points in their life and how that informs the rest of them. And I think specifically, we see that, with Dooku. And so to me, these are long enough, but you do have to have watched everything. And that's not, I think, a criticism. I think there is a point in every fandom where you are going to be making some things just for fans. And I don't think that's a bad thing here. And to me, it's ultimately rewarding because every one of these stories in different ways pulled at my heartstrings because of the way it was making those larger connections with these character stories and now then resonating throughout the rest of the saga. It's like each one of these episodes is it's like that pebble in the lake, and the ripples just flow out into the rest of their life. And so to me, I didn't need these to be longer because it's the perfect economic storytelling.
I have something I'll throw out there that I know will tickle your fancy to hear the comparison. But yes, if you're a longtime fan, these are absolute treat. This is the present you never expected to get, but when you got it, you suddenly realize this is what you always wanted. So it is the ultimate love letter to fans. I agree with you on that. However, I will say it is also essential viewing and something that I would use here and there. If somebody's just seen the movies, I might not show them the first episode of this series, but I would show them the Dooku arc. Because Dooku doesn't get a lot of screen time in the prequel trilogy. I think that these little snackable bits act like Tolkien's appendices. And we know that Dave Filoni is a Tolkien fan. But this is like, do you need to know about the Council of Erebor to love The Hobbit? Nope. I didn't even read the appendices for Lord of the Rings for years. I don't think I've ever read all of them. Mm-hmm. But when you read it, you go, oh, okay, that's interesting. That does explain something. It's not something I was going to die without having, but now that I have it, that adds, like you were saying, more shading to the story. Makes it very, very interesting. So I would view these as those sort of little appendices hits. I think it's also incredibly important. We do, in fact, live in a different entertainment landscape. And these shorter episodes are vital to conveying the little hits, because what is the trap that every longtime fan of any franchise falls into? Tell me about the Marvel movies. Well, okay, Infinity Stone, blah, 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 and you can go on and on and on and on. But when you have these little bits, you could say, oh, that's a question you had. Yeah. Here's the moment where Dooku turned. Oh, yeah. Here's his relationship with Qui-Gon. Here's this. Here's that. Here's why Ahsoka was so incredible during Order 66. Here's our first introduction, to the Inquisitors and Ahsoka, and does a Jedi need a lightsaber to win, sort of thing. And it's, I think it's, instead of all of these different streaming series that run away from the fact that the landscape has changed for entertainment expectations, this feels like a series that embraces it and says, not everything needs to be an hour-long show. You can tell this bit of story in 15 minutes. And the thing is, I could watch this 3-episode arc. Bang. And it functions as an episode.
Yeah.
But I can watch it in little bits.
Well, and I think the thing is that these episodes themselves don't need to be longer, because they are telling the story they need to tell. Mm-hmm. And were meant to tell, because they then connect with the larger story itself, right? And they're not meant to tell the larger story. They're meant to tell the specific moments that are pinch points for these characters' lives.
Allow me to also throw this out there, that there, I think, is a lesson with this for how they should be approaching. Granted, we got the Mandalorian and everything, but there are plenty of opportunities to start filling in more of those gaps between the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy, and do some world building with little 15-minute episodes.
Yeah.
Fans would eat that up. Okay, the Mandalorian's doing some heavy lifting with that right now. But a supplementary thing showing somebody out on the fringes, or somebody that's on the run, or somebody that's helping build this, or the first signs of the First Order, or something like that. Those little bits help so that you don't have to hijack an episode of the Book of Boba Fett to tell what's going on with Luke. You can have a little 15-minute thing you see over there. Oh, that's what's going on over there.
Well, and obviously it makes me think the fact that, if you want to do Tales of the Jedi Season 2, there's definitely places where you can tell other stories, and that you're just rife for that. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, John, was, these are presented in chronological order, which is a really interesting choice. And the fact that if you were actually to watch Star Wars from start to finish, the first thing you would actually watch is Ahsoka's birth.
Yep.
And so did it work for you to have the stories presented this way? Or would you rather have them been in like the Ahsoka journey batch, and then, Dooku's journey batch?
What Ahsoka's birth, what age was Ahsoka when she became Anakin's apprentice? I forget.
So we know that Togrutans themselves age differently than humans because they live longer. Mm-hmm. And, I believe, Ahsoka was supposed to be somewhere around 14, but that's would be in, I think, human reckoning. So I think she's actually older than that. My guess is that, by her people's standards, she's more 25. So this, it puts this story of her birth, I think 15 years before the happenings of the Phantom Menace.
Okay.
And so that's just me doing some rough estimations and just kind of guesswork because, again, like, Yoda's people.
Oh, I'm not
Grogu,
I am not rejecting what you're saying at all. I'm actually just trying to make sure that the math is working out in my own head.
Yeah. So,
because
and I had to do the same thing as well because I was like, I don't know exactly. And then, yeah.
Well, and there's also, look, this could rankle some, but something like this is how you expand it outward because everybody says it needs to be more than the Skywalker saga. And what you're laying out there and the fact that, yes, okay, you could therefore start this whole thing off with Ahsoka's birth, which means, okay, that means that we've now very, very quietly subverted this so that now I have this other track I can follow where the story of Ahsoka becomes a larger story within the Star Wars universe so that it doesn't remove or deconstruct the Skywalker saga. Anakin's still super duper important, but it also at the same time elevates and changes our perspective on what the even larger story is.
Right.
And Ahsoka becomes the champion of that larger arc.
Well, and becomes the connection point for every point of Star Wars history, for the most part.
Which is trippy, which is extremely trippy, because Ahsoka now has always been there and will always be there and has always belonged and it's absolutely mind-numbing. Well, like you just said, she touches every single era. And it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy because everybody was always looking for it's like the whole thing where I'm not trying to be too reductive where people said, oh, well, where's a female Star Wars hero? They didn't look for what was right in front of their face this whole time.
So what we're saying is that Ahsoka is the unified theory.
Yes.
Okay.
She's the unified theory of Star Wars. Yes.
So let's dive into Ahsoka's journey, and we're going to cover these within the specific arcs for the characters, so we can kind of talk through them specifically like that. And starting with life and death, I was actually struck by the fact that when this character was first brought to screen, the reception for her was less than celebrated. And now we're at the point where Dave can tell a story about Ahsoka's birth and first year of life, and people are riveted, and, Baby Yoda's having to check the door to see who's cuter now.
Yeah. Yes. And I think that, like so many other things in Star Wars, there's a very cross-cultural sort of sensibility reflected in Ahsoka's story. It feels very much like it's very evocative of a Kurosawa type story, one of his samurai stories.
Yes,
and it's down to the architecture of the town, to the way that the townsfolk interact, to the way that you have this elder, to the way that you have this mystical event having to do with nature and Ahsoka's connection to it. Nature being the Force in this circumstance, but the magical changeling child that can commune with the larger world so effortlessly. On top of that, it becomes a very important story about how powerful Ahsoka truly is, how innately powerful she is. I hate saying the word powerful, but like how innately connected she is to the Force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting, because the big narrative thread, I think, here is the fact that, her mother from the very beginning is teaching her about the circle of life, basically, helping her understand life and death and the beauty of both and the way that it is all interconnected. And to have respect for all life, even when, as they do, they hunt and take life, and that life feeds many others. And, it's very, like you were saying, just kind of evocative of the idea of, what we see in, like, The Lion King. But I think that's something that's so interesting, of course, is the way that connects then with the very last chapter with Resolve. It really reminded me of, the Kirk quote from Star Trek II, where he says, how we face death is at least as important as how we face life. And that's almost what it seems like, Ahsoka's mother is teaching her from the very beginning, that we must face both, and we must think about both, and we must recognize, almost the fragility of all of this and respect it. And I think that's something that's really important. But I also liked what you just said about the way in which we see her face off against the mythical, evil or whatever. And, it brings to mind that from the very beginning, Ahsoka faces the darkness and the light conquers it, and that's when at the end of that episode, her parents are like, how? And the elder of the village, says that she's Jedi. And it brings to mind too that this is the key, is that Ahsoka then, even when she is not quote unquote a Jedi, or even would not call herself a Jedi anymore, what she is living is Jedi principles, like what Jedi are meant to be. Even before she's cognizant of what that is, Ahsoka is Jedi.
The Elder is giving us a hint as to who she believes the Jedi to be, what the perception of what a Jedi is at this point in time, before the Jedi image has been tarnished both fairly and unfairly by the dark times. Yes.
Yeah. I think also quite interesting too, we saw baby Grogu, put to sleep the Rancor, and here, we see baby Ahsoka tame the wild, whatever they want to call that thing. It's a liger, tiger thing, whatever.
Let's just call it a
saber-toothed tiger cat, something.
Yeah, something like that.
And I just, again, I think you were pointing to her innate power in the Force, and we always knew that Yoda's species was very strong in the Force. I mean, we see that in the Dooku arc with Yaddle, and we saw it with Yoda, and we've seen it with Grogu and what he's able to do even at his age. And so I think it gives us an insight into, who this character is and, who she's going to be, which is also, I think, what makes Practice Perfect really interesting, because you mentioned earlier, but this whole episode really is about helping explain how Ahsoka could survive when others couldn't in Order 66.
Well, because she was trained by the one other Jedi that would have been able to survive as well, had he not been on the wrong side of that exchange. I think that what's beautiful about it, too, is every interaction with Ahsoka like this, with Anakin, makes him more tragic. And that's the trick. And it's something that made me, over time, somewhat tune out of expanded universe stuff, both, regardless of the era, is this takes a small moment with Anakin, and instead of treating it as a perfunctory moment of, oh, look, we get to see Anakin with Ahsoka, this little episode adds so much depth to their relationship that we didn't think we could get any more facets to, but additionally further makes Anakin's tragedy a tragedy, because you see that he wasn't sitting there. I mean, unlike Dooku, he's not plotting these terrible things or taking part in anything like that. He is actually in this moment, a great teacher. Because he's not letting Ahsoka off the hook, and he's simply demanding of her the same thing he demands of himself. And that's always, if you look at those great training arcs out there, whether it's Rocky, whether it's a samurai film, whether it's the 39 Chambers of Shaolin or something like that, there's always the sense of, I see greatness, and I'm not going to take it easy on greatness. Why should I take it easy on you? Because I know you can survive and you can endure. The best teacher says, I'm challenging you not because I want you to fail. I'm challenging you because I know you can succeed. So Anakin doesn't say at some point, oh, well, this is too hard, but, think about it. He sits there and he says, again, until Ahsoka gets to that point where she realizes, oh, this isn't just to torture me. This could potentially save my life, and it literally does.
Well, and Anakin trains people to survive because he knows he's not always going to be there to help them survive. I mean, we saw it in the Onderon arc. He begins the rebellion, and here he trains a person to be able to defy the Emperor's order that he helps enforce. And, what's beautiful, and like you said, I think you nailed it in the sense that this makes Anakin so much more tragic because you can see how much Anakin actually truly does care, and it's his caring that actually helps people become the best version of themselves. This really does make Ahsoka a better version of herself. He pushes her, and it's not comfortable, and it's not easy, but he pushes her to be the best version of herself that she can be, and somebody she didn't even know she could be. And when you couple that with, who we saw her to be from the moment she was born, which she's innately powerful, it's him honing her skill. Even if you have talent, you still have to practice. Every great athlete will tell you that. It doesn't matter how talented you are, you still have to get out there and practice day in and day out. And this is what Anakin pushes her to do. And I think that's so interesting because, think about this. Anakin came to the Order and thought he was going to be trained by Qui-Gon Jinn, and then Qui-Gon Jinn died. So he's well aware of the fact that Jedi are not invincible, even though he thought Great so point. In Episode 1. No one can kill a Jedi. And so, therefore, he knows, even with his own Padawan, he might not always be there to make sure she's alive, and he even says that. And I think, this rightly just picks up so well with, what we see from his life and his psychology to why he would be doing this in the first place.
Yes. And it is one of the beautiful things as well that I think that it speaks to the fact that we've seen Ahsoka's beginning moment before this now. And like we're saying, she's innately powerful, but she's innately connected to the Force. And it puts it right there in front of you. There's nobody else who could really train her and get her to her full potential except for Anakin Skywalker. He's the only one that's going to get her there because of who he is. Not just his personality, but also the fact that he's innately connected and powerful the same way. He's going to be able to plug into and understand her connection in a way no other Jedi will, even Master Yoda. This doesn't take anything away from Yoda, but Yoda's 900, well, almost 900 by this point. Anakin is a little bit closer there and a little bit more, lack of a better term, qualified to be training Ahsoka this way. And Obi-Wan, I know this will upset you. Obi-Wan couldn't get Ahsoka to this point. Not because Obi-Wan's a bad teacher or a bad person or a bad Jedi or a bad Jedi Master or anything like that, but because it takes Anakin to get her to this point. Anakin's the only one who's going to be able to do it.
No, I mean, I think you're right, and part of that is his attachment to her, and so that's where I think, what's so interesting about this is that I think it does show that being attached to someone does not necessarily mean it's a bad thing if rightly focused. And, here are these moments where it is, I think, rightly focused. You see that training room and everybody's impressed. Caleb Dune is there with Depa Billaba, and he's pretty impressed of what, Ahsoka can do. And so is everybody else. But Anakin knows that droids are one thing, but that they're non-thinking, stupid machines, right? And so therefore it's easy to predict as a Jedi what that binary machine is going to do, whereas a human being or a being is just completely different. Be so erratic that it's much harder to read and make those decisions with, and so because they do unexpected things, and therefore he trains her against the very best.
Which then plays into the next episode where she's able to defeat an Inquisitor without her saber.
Right.
She's able to win that. And that is, I think, also a beautiful nod to where the Bad Batch will later find themselves, of being those people who are trying to hide, but still find themselves in situations where they're going to help.
Yeah.
Because inevitably a good person is always going to be looking for whatever way, whether it's very visible or whether it's invisible or what have you, that good person can't help themselves from trying to do good. Yeah. And I think that's actually something that I like, because it mirrors and reinforces the Bad Batch's arc as we start heading into season 2, but also into where Ahsoka's going to go in Rebels. She can't stay away. She has to take part in this. She has to do something. And I think that's really important, because I think it does tie in to what Anakin puts her through in the 5th episode. And that plays right into the 6th. And I also, we've talked about the artistry with it and everything, but I think it also speaks to, I have to stop every so often and say, that the art direction, the framing, the editing, all of those things are brilliant. But what these animated shows will never get enough credit for, I think, is their design sensibilities, because that Inquisitor was legitimately terrifying to look at. That was an unsettling creature to behold. And I think it's very telling as well, because you go from the 5th episode to the 6th episode, and you see this representative horror of what the world has become for somebody like Ahsoka. That Inquisitor embodies the evil that is everywhere now. And in the very previous episode, we've seen her surrounded by good support and love. And it's a very important, I think, juxtaposition.
Well, and I think that too, in the episode it plays out, is obviously there are people who are willing to support her. She goes to Padme's funeral, she runs into Bail Organa, and, Bail hands her the communications device and lets her know that if she ever needs anything, he's there for her. And that they need her, and she's tired of fighting. She's worn out. She's like a bit like Obi-Wan Kenobi, she's lost everything again. And she now lives in fear, like who's looking out for her? She knows she has to always be looking over her shoulder. She has to have her head on a swivel. And yet, I love that Bail reminds her that, there's a duty and an obligation to uphold when you can. And so Ahsoka, like you were saying, she can't help being Jedi. Even when her life might be in danger because somebody might see her do something, when somebody's in need of saving, she's not going to just sit there and do nothing. And, I think it's so beautiful. And I, like you said too, I mean, this is a perfect picture of, immediately how the Empire is quote unquote caring for people, right? I mean, it's just such a terrible thing. This kid, thinks he's going to get rewarded, and the reward is death. And so I really, really love that the way that this is tying into the Bad Batch, the way this is tying into Andor, the crush of the Empire. And so all of this in this episode I thought was really beautiful. Now, there is one novel-sized elephant in the room, and that's the Ahsoka novel, and how this kind of goes against that. Does that bother you in any way, or does it
but
even
before we jump
you?
over the Dooku stuff, how long have you known me?
Oh, pretty long time now. Yeah.
Pretty long time.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think the answer is to that question?
Well, I think the answer is going to be no.
That's correct.
Okay.
I didn't even think of the Ahsoka novel while I was watching this. Honestly, Star Wars is primarily a visual medium. This series is a stunning example and reminder of that. As much as I might enjoy a book here or there, if somebody with a reasonable amount of authority puts together something like this and walks forward and says, this happened instead, my brain will go through and completely scrub that book from my memory, so that when you ask me a question, do you care that it kind of contradicts the Ahsoka novel? It takes me a second to go, there was an Ahsoka novel? Oh, right, yeah. No, don't care.
Right.
It's no problem at all.
Well, and Dave had already changed the Ahsoka novel anyway, in the sense that he did that with the last season of the Clone Wars. So I don't really have an issue with it. I'm with you. To me, Star Wars has always been what's on screen is canon first. Everything else can be overwritten no matter what you say about anything else. And so, to me, this being the story about how Ahsoka gets back in the fight, how she wins a lightsaber back so that she will be able to create the twin white blades. This is the story for me. And, I know what novels are. They are only supplements of what we see on screen. And so it never bothers me that somebody might want to override that. As much as I love the book Dark Disciple, if Dave wants to come back and do Tales of the Jedi Season 2, and it's just an 8-episode arc about, Quinlan Vos and Asajj Ventress, and it changes what happened in the novel, okay. I'm all for that, because it would be what's on screen. It's this visual medium. And so that's not saying that I don't love these novels, but I also don't, I don't put them at the same level ever as what we see on screen.
I will always turn that dial back. I'll even leapfrog back past the Return of the Jedi novelization, which has its own set of things, that contradict, quote unquote, the film that came out, and then et cetera, et cetera. But I'll go all the way back to the Empire Strikes Back novelization and say Yoda was 4 feet tall and blue in the Empire Strikes Back novelization. And I'll even roll it even further back from that. And the Star Wars novelization, there are differences. And it's different media, but Star Wars is a film. And the Star Wars films are films first. And everything else is an adaptation of those works. And the film will always win. Whether it's a streaming series or whether it's anything else. You could have, let's go to the episode 1 story sticker book that had Bail Organa in it. And I hate to break it to you, that wasn't played by Jimmy Smits. It's one of those things where, it'll never bother me, ever bother me.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. So I definitely think it is time that we do jump to Dooku's journey, because there is so much to talk about there. And in many ways, I think, I would say the real meat of the story for this series came with Dooku's journey in the first episode, Justice, which I think really which does such a incredible job of driving home the idea that Dooku is seeing the corruption of the Senate, is seeing the corruption of the Republic, is seeing the corruption even in the Jedi being so close to the Senate that it is beginning to bother him. And it's almost like a boiling over point here. And I don't know if it's the first moment it's happened, but it seems to be one of the most pinnacle moments in his journey towards making the decision that he's going to make. And what this touches on with this corruption and how, the senator is the longest standing senator, we learned that this senator has made it possible for them to continually be reelected through most likely election fraud. And I was like, wow, this is getting really close to home here. So like, this is the way in which I think Star Wars does such a great job of connecting with wherever you are now, but also reaching back and kind of like picking up all of these historical pieces for characters and what this does for Dooku's journey to be, slapped in the face with this kind of corruption. It really does feel like this is his first big breaking point.
Three things, and this is what's going to be tough, is I know we've talked a lot about Ahsoka, but this Dooku stuff really was close to my heart in a lot of ways. I blogged about this in the past. I've talked about it forever. We've gone back and forth about it. You've heard me say this numerous times, but Dooku is always a character that I felt didn't get enough sympathy from the fans, that didn't get enough understanding. Again, I know it doesn't have as much screen time in the prequel movies as, would elicit that. But even in the Clone Wars, he's basically just pure evil. There are hints that there was something more to him, but you see a lot of evil. This really hits close to home because I think that it's extremely relatable from the perspective of people who really believed in something and have suddenly found out that what they believed in was true, but the other people who were supposed to believe in it with them were liars. And it's that intense feeling of betrayal and anger. And I think that the three things I'll call out specifically in this episode. One, again, going to the production design. It's so brilliant that the coloration of Dooku is a little bit paler than Qui-Gon. And by the way, seeing Qui-Gon's very Liam Neeson-like collarbones.
Oh, yes.
Very beautiful touch. The village looks very much like an old Hammer horror film. And to have the character that was played by Dracula show up in this village, I chuckled. I went, like, I got it right off the bat. I thought it was beautiful. I'm not saying other people didn't. I'm just saying, like, that made me giggle the first time I saw it. Then to have that moment of Dooku being stopped by Qui-Gon. And I think one of the most beautiful lines in all 6 episodes is when he says to Qui-Gon, "You saved a lot of lives today." He's openly admitting to Qui-Gon, "Thanks. If it hadn't been for you, I would have kept going."
Yeah, I would have killed everyone.
It expands Qui-Gon. It makes Qui-Gon even more interesting than he already was. And then the third thing is that Dooku, even though he pulls back thanks to Qui-Gon, he receives a lesson here, unintentionally, that the way to make the galaxy right is to force it to be right. Because he gets his ultimate goal at the end of this. He cows the senator, gets the senator's son to promise to make things better, and cures an ill because of his anger and because of his righteous fury that's going to lead to the rage. Death of... Yeah. That's the lesson he's going to walk away from. walk away with from this. That this is how you make the galaxy right. You force it to be right, which is the exact same lesson that Anakin's going to learn. And the reason Anakin falls too.
It's funny you say, when you're saying that, I thought of, Angry Young Man from Billy Joel.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Dooku is. He's an angry middle-aged man, I guess. So...
Hey, all the more reason for me to relate to him.
But, a question that became in the episode, and as you were speaking, I was really thinking about how this is the big question of the episode, which is, how did the Jedi enforce justice when they're so beholden to the Senate? And Dooku comes up against that question here, because the senator says, arrest these people. You work for me. And he has to remind him saying, no, we work for the people of this galaxy. And that's the differentiation that he sees. I think it's clearly the lesson one of the lessons I think Qui-Gon takes with him, right? Which he sees himself more as a person, that is in tune with, trying to be there for the people of the galaxy. Although even he kind of falls into the trap, when it's like, why isn't he, helping end slavery on Tatooine? Shouldn't that be something that they should be doing? Except that they're not there because the Senate doesn't care. And so therefore neither do the Jedi. And so it really creates this really big question there. And one of the things I was really interested did the senatorial garb and his guards, it really had this like French inspiration to me, which reminded me
the
of
gendarme.
Of that, when you think of almost like the French Revolution and the aristocrats taking over and all those type of things, or even think of the monarchy beforehand, not caring about people and let them eat cake, yada yada. And again, that it's so evocative, like you were talking about, and you've mentioned a few times, just the design work here. And I think these little touches just kind of help key you in, and that's one of the beauties of Star Wars, which is also pulling from real history to create things. And so if you know anything about history, you start to pick up those little pieces and how they inform the story of Dooku and what he's facing here. And I really appreciate that. But yeah, I think, oh my gosh, this first episode, I loved how bleak it was. The town. Like the impact of this senator's reign over this planet and working as their senator in the Republic has led to this. And that mood, I think, then permeates the rest of these episodes for Dooku. And I think it's that bleakness where we talked about earlier, he's the idealist, and therefore the ideal that he was striving for with this thing that he believed in, he no longer believes anymore. And here was the first major crack that showed him that it wasn't going to work. Which, leads me to the beautiful episode of choices. And first, I wanted to ask you this question, because I've heard this criticism of this episode, and I wanted to get your take on it, is that it's basically a redo of the episode we just got. Do you agree with that, or do you feel like this adds to the journey for Dooku?
Other people say it as a joke, and I say it with love in my heart and truth. It's like poetry, it rhymes. And I think that it has a very important place, because you see, when it's not Qui-Gon with him, how the situation plays out differently. How things are, if anything, I think that it's a brilliant episode because it expands and further condemns Mace Windu for being, at times, something of a jackass and an authoritarian in his own right.
That's putting it mildly.
So I think it's very important, because you see Dooku when he's in this horrible situation in that village, and a person of true compassion who's motivated by true ideals and true faith is there with Dooku. There's no butting up of heads. There's a gentle, hey, remember who we are. And Dooku responds to that. Whereas Windu is pushing Dooku exactly the same way he pushes Anakin. No, I'm right. Do what I say. This is the way we do things. This is what's right. And how does somebody like Dooku react to that? Same way somebody like Anakin reacts to that. Hey, jackass, what are you talking about? And I think it's just very important. Again, it's that poetry to it. And I think that it is an episode that winds up not getting the correct amount of affection, is the only way I can say it, because it's sandwiched between two episodes that are so incredible. And, and we're about to jump to the one that really was a major, just like, blow to the heart sort of thing and humanizing moment for Dooku. But I think what's super important about this episode is showing that Dooku and Windu are basically equals. Dooku might fancy himself a bit better than Windu in some ways. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, Windu gets elevated to the council. And Dooku has that moment of saying, did you always know that this was what was on the line? And Windu, maybe betraying that his own selfish motivations got in the way of how he handled things. And in a sense, has got to be somewhat aware that Dooku got kind of screwed over here. And look, people can feel free to disagree with that all that you want. Dooku maybe didn't belong on the council, but again, we have an echo of Anakin. Instead of doing what Qui-Gon does, which is show compassion and love and support and reminding of the true tenets of the faith, if you will, Windu is such an incredibly rigid a-hole that he pushes away the one person that he should be pulling close and nurturing instead of excluding and building a wall around this person, making them feel isolated and unloved by their family, basically. Dooku feels incredibly betrayed at the end of this episode. And so, yeah, I think it's an important and a good episode.
I think you mentioned some of the things that I really feel about this episode and why it actually is quite different than the first episode. Yes, there's the layer of corruption, but the layer of corruption here is not necessarily about another senator. The layer of corruption here is about the corruption of the Jedi. Dooku is frustrated with Mace Windu, who cares more about protocol than he does people. And then at the end, to have him ascended to the council is, I think, one of the things that breaks his faith with the council itself. I think the problem here is that, one of the guards that they capture at the end, the only one that ends up being alive, says that, that the Jedi only care about law and order for those in power, for those that are rich, And I think that this is so beautiful in reinforcing that the Jedi are too wrapped up in politics. Mace Windu says they're not, but they legitimately are. And mainly because somebody like Mace Windu is not willing to think outside the box. He says, oh, we have our council. We're not driven by, our egos or our, politics. But that's a bunch of BS. Mace is clearly driven by his politics and by his ego. And the problem is you have two big egos butting heads in this episode. And I think the interesting thing is that, and we'll talk about it in a second, but that last episode actually reinforces that maybe Qui-Gon and Dooku really were needed on the council to add voice and imagination to something that had lacked imagination for way too long. Because too many people who were just rule followers ended up on the council. And so, I think that's what makes this episode so important. Plus, this episode takes place on Raxus Sedungus, which is the Confederacy's Senate home. This is where you'll have that episode with Mina Von Terry and Padme when they visit the Confederacy's Senate building. So this is a planet to which Dooku is going to utilize their unrest with what they see happening in the Republic. And my guess is this may be one of the first planets he's able to pull to the side of the Confederacy of Separatists. So this episode is incredibly important, and in many ways, it's because, yes, it is reinforcing the messages of the first episode, but it's also compounding those by showing us that the Jedi are just as corrupt at this point as the Republic itself. And it's because they are too in bed with the Senate, and they can't see it. And the only person who can see it is somebody that nobody wants to listen to.
Yes. And it shows how the council makes its same mistakes over and over again. It pushes Dooku away when it should pull him close and listen to him. It pushes Qui-Gon away because he doesn't listen, and you can't help but have the feeling that Qui-Gon's relationship to Dooku also keeps him off the council. And then you have Anakin, who, by that point, Sidious has figured out, okay, I just have to make him mistrust the council and then make the council mistrust him by simply being friendly with him. And it suddenly makes everything in episode 3 even more brilliant on the part of Sidious, because he's paid attention and he understands the trap that the Jedi will walk right into, not just in terms of running the war or anything like that, but he says to Anakin in episode 3, they need you, Anakin, more than they know. He's learned that by this point. They needed Dooku and they didn't pay attention. They needed Qui-Gon and they didn't pay attention. Anakin drops in Sidious's lap and he's like, oh, yes. Jackpot. I got this one. I know how to play this hand. I know exactly how to play the hand that I've been dealt. And I think that in terms of playing the hand that he's dealt, I think what's also additionally interesting is, I'm dying to get to the next episode in the arc here. Let's
talk about the Sith Lord.
Let's go right into it, and we'll double back through and everything. But jumping right through to that whole Sidious knowing how to play things, I think that I gotta ask you, when Dooku goes there and he says, he's saying, "What have I lost? Qui-Gon is dead now," and Sidious says, "I lost an apprentice too." There are these little hints when Sidious goes onto the lava shore and sees Anakin and touches him somewhat tenderly on the forehead. And that line there about losing an apprentice too, there's almost this sense that there's this little spark of caring, non-selfish motivation in Sidious. This little tiny spark of humanity that it's a teeny tiny little ember that just won't go away. Do you think he was expressing any affection for Maul, or am I reading too much into that moment?
I think that is a really interesting read. It's not one that I took it as. I took it as him pretending to have that to make Dooku feel bad. To be like, you're not the only one who lost an apprentice. I lost an apprentice too. He's such a manipulator, and so he's psychologically manipulating Dooku in this moment to make him think that he's in the same position that he is. Right? I don't think he cares, because what I got from this episode is that Maul was always expendable. Because he had already been... And I'm not saying that you're not saying that, but...
Yeah.
But the fact that, he had already been working with Dooku, and I think in many ways, for Sidious, it's actually better for Maul to die because the politician that Dooku is going to be much more needed now than the blunt force trauma character of Maul.
No question. And I wasn't trying to overstate. I was saying it literally is a tiny little ember.
Oh, sure.
In the sense that it's like, oh, I like that kid. He was pretty good. Ah, okay. Oh, well. So it's not like he felt love for Maul or selfless identity, but he'd spent enough time with it. He'd raised Maul from a child, well, not a child necessarily, but, he'd been with Maul long enough and honed him to where he was that there's a bit of regret of, I spent a lot of time with that guy and he was pretty good at what he did. Oh, well. Okay. Well, I mean, I kind of knew he was going to die, but it's a shame. Why? Maybe I'll bring him back as a half robot spider. Who knows? But the true star of this episode is Yaddle. Who would have thought that in 15 minutes Yaddle would go from sort of obscure joke background character to, I would like an action figure, please. Maybe a book about Yaddle, something like that. That would be pretty awesome.
I mean, one of my favorite characters now of all time. In all honesty, I just that's not overstating it.
And I had no idea that was Bryce Dallas Howard the first time I heard it.
So good. She was so good.
Whoever directed the voice acting, was in the booth there, man, because she did a fantastic job. But also something I got to call out: Corey Burton as Dooku.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Pay attention to the way he says the word peace.
Yes.
It's so beautiful. Every time he says peace, that in peace is just extended ever so slightly to make it a menacing word. Beautiful vocal work, especially here in this episode. Well,
and then it makes it so impactful when she says, so many have suffered for what you call peace. And it it breaks your heart because the beauty of this episode is the way that, you see, because this takes place in and between and at the end of The Phantom Menace. And you see that Yaddle and Qui-Gon are close, which is really a cool thing because, what she later confesses to Dooku, saying that after his death, she has stepped down from the council because she's realized he's been right about a lot of things. And it's such an interesting thing because you see this triumvirate of characters who, if they had worked together, they could have changed the whole course of the Star Wars history. And yet, by that point, Dooku has already been pulled aside by Sidious and already is working on their machinations to create the greater good that they're going to be fighting for, the quote-unquote greater good, and the remaking of the galaxy. And it's just so incredibly sad because it, and it's so important because the prequels are meant to be sad, right? It is about this fall of a republic. It's about the way this shining example, the Jedi and the Republic, for over 1,000 generations, devolves into something that implodes. And I love it because you also see played here that Dooku, realizing that he is in part responsible for Qui-Gon's death, in many ways is the very thing that is the complete breaking point for him to choose evil. In the same way Anakin killing Mace Windu is the thing that breaks him. He's made the choice he can't go back from. And the beauty here is that even in that moment, Yaddle still offers him redemption. She says, there's still a way for you to come back. I don't care what he said. I don't care what you've done. Just come back. We can defeat this Sith Lord, and then we can figure it out together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so heartbreaking. And again, even in these 15 minutes of this episode, the emotion and characterization that Bryce Dallas Howard puts into this character makes her a fully rounded character. It's incredible work. And every single part of this episode is just absolutely gorgeous, because what I love too, and I know I'm just kind of rambling at this point because it's so great, but when she pushes the door up, she lets the light in on Dooku one more time.
Yep.
To give him one more chance. And I love you see Sidious, like, afraid of the light, like a rat, scurrying away almost. And Dooku again makes the decision to double down on his choice. And again, it's the same thing that happens with Anakin. He decides to fight Obi-Wan to the death. He doubles down on his decision. And it kind of brings back to the line. Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny. And this episode is just so absolutely stunning in every way, shape, and form. It rivals the Mortis episode. It rivals the Yoda arc episodes with beauty and just the amount of emotion that comes in there. I mean, I found myself in tears at the end of this episode just because of what had happened and what we had just seen, and to finally give us the fall of Dooku in this way, so well done. So well done.
This was the one where that I went back and watched again almost immediately that night, and because I watched one a day, but this was the one where I doubled back. I believe I want you to head check me on this, but I swear I heard some echoes of Blade Runner or Blade Runner 2049.
Oh yes,
in the beginning of this. Yeah, there were definitely echoes there. But this is the one of all six. As much as I loved all six of them, this is the one that I point to as if I'm hinging an award nomination or an award that I'm giving, this is the episode where I say this is the one where everything is just perfect, not to diminish anything else. I loved every bit of this from beginning to finish, but this one is so gorgeous. And additionally, this episode then followed by Ahsoka learning how to defend herself and seeing how it pays off for Order 66. That whole thing, 4 and 5 together, are such an incredible pivot point, because it literally is it's like two gut punches in a row of you realize how important both of these moments are for two different reasons. And this is specifically where these two arcs cross over. Why these two arcs are so important to tell at the same time. And you see that counterbalance of the light starting to go out, and then the spark reigniting with what Anakin is laying in place there, so that it can continue. The fire can continue burning until Luke shows up and the galaxy can try to start healing as a whole again.
The fire rises.
Yeah, basically.
I was just thinking too, one of the things that this also does is answer a question that nobody knew they needed answered, which is what happened to Yaddle. But not only what happened to her, but we see that with the death of Qui-Gon Jinn and with the death of Yaddle, two beings who could have made an incredible difference in the course and the trajectory of the Jedi Council are gone.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, evil is able to prevail much easier than if they had survived. And it just goes to show these two voices being snuffed out at the beginning make Sidious's job so much easier.
Yes, and you realize to speak to Sidious's machinations, can't be any accident that, he threw Maul at Qui-Gon, knowing full well, apparently, that Maul was going to bite it in the process, or could bite it in the process, because he's going, all in on Dooku, but he knows he's got to get rid of Qui-Gon and Yaddle. And suddenly Sidious seems even more diabolically brilliant, because he's executed a gambit where he knows Dooku wouldn't be able to pull his saber against Qui-Gon.
Yeah. Oh, no.
And so in a very large sense, it's like separating Obi-Wan and Anakin in Episode 3, so that Obi-Wan is not there to talk Anakin back off the brink.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I 100% agree with you, because I was just thinking about how, we get that little bit where Qui-Gon and Dooku have a conversation, and Dooku mentions how he won't be there, and Qui-Gon says, "Don't worry, Obi-Wan is there now, and he more than is capable." He talks about always singing Obi-Wan's praises, and of course that has a nice connection with Episode 2. But we also see that, Obi-Wan was the one who was able to take out Maul in the end. And he's the one who, could defeat Anakin. And, so it's just all these little connection points. And I think all these little rhyming motifs, George Lucas always talked about this idea of Star Wars rhyming. And I think that's the beauty of the way that these 6 stories ended up rhyming with themselves, and then with the larger saga in general. And so we could probably spend another hour, John, I think, talking about this series. But I do have to ask you one question before we get to our ratings. We kind of hinted or teased a little about the idea of a season 2. Would you want more Tales of the Jedi?
Yes. I'm ready to demand more Tales of the Jedi. Yes. That's a no-brainer. But on the one condition that it's allowed to be the labor of love that this was. I don't want, this should be a once in a while, every so often we get the itch to do this. And we have a couple of important stories to tell, but it's not really in the context of another series. The Dooku thing doesn't fit in Bad Batch or Andor or anything else that they have going on right now.
Right.
So, Tales of the Jedi? Okay, yeah, you know what? This is where we tell these little stories that don't fit somewhere else. We don't have to hijack somebody else's show to tell them. Yes, I think they've given themselves a perfect template for how to tell these little important stories going forward.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you, and I 100% want more Tales of the Jedi. It's just so wonderfully crafted. I think you said it earlier. It truly is a love letter to fans. And so I don't know if I need to ask this question, but we do here on the 602 Club, John. What would you rate Tales of the Jedi?
5, without hesitation. This is essential Star Wars. This needs to exist. This is the one thing that's going to get under my skin about this is probably the same thing that's going to remain under my skin about Bad Batch, which is I would like to own these, please, on disc so that I can watch them in full 4K without having compression bit rates screwing me over with the picture quality. I don't care how much you promise that picture quality is perfect, Disney Plus. I know that you're lying to me. I know my ISP is lying to me. I would like these discs because I want them in the. I want the full frame rate. I want the full everything. I want everything. Release them.
I want the HDR. I want everything.
I want everything. I don't without any compression or anything like that. I want them. And how about you, Matt?
I mean, it's a 5. It's just clearly a 5, and it's not just because I'm a fan or anything like that. If anybody has listened to John and I long enough, we love Star Wars, but we are not afraid to say when something doesn't live up to our expectations, and then give those reasons why we feel that's not the case. I think that these are incredibly beautiful, lovingly crafted stories by people who truly care about Star Wars and understand Star Wars on a level that it's hard for even myself to understand it. But I can appreciate the intense amount of labor of love, beauty that's been poured into every single frame. And you can tell that every single frame has been intensely scrutinized to make it perfect. In the same way that Lucas would do the same thing, especially when he could do that in the prequels, where he just wanted it to be as perfect as he could make it at the time. And so this is clearly 5 stars. I highly recommend it. Like you, John, please let us own this on a 4K disc, because it would be phenomenal. And I think it would be just beyond brilliant to be able to see this in its full, unadulterated beauty. And so let us have that. But John, if people wanted to, possibly catch up with you and see what else you've got going on out there these days, where would they find you?
Look for Castle Junkie in your social media network of choice. And you can also find me over on the Nerd Party Network co-hosting House Lights, where we look at the works of directors in different combinations and series and eras and decades. It's a lot of fun. Co-host that with Tristan Riddell and Darren Moser. And of course, you can find me also on the Nerd Party co-hosting a Star Wars-focused show called Aggressive Negotiations with you, Matthew Rushing.
Well, and John, when I am not doing that, of course, you can find me all over the place on social media under the name MattRushing02, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero. You can also find me here on the network outside the 602 Club doing literary treks about the books and the comics of Star Trek, The Orb about Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Warp 5 about Star Trek Enterprise, Saddle Up about Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and The Artificial Tango about Star Trek Picard. And then when I wasn't doing Aggressive Negotiations with you, John, over on the Nerd Party Network, you could find me on a completed show with Dre Kaufman, where we talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time, and that was called Owl Post. But thank you so much for joining us, and may the Force be with you.